let's define mast cells first. So, what exactly are mast cells, and what's the purpose of them?
So that's a great question. Mast cells are a kind of blood cell that release histamine in response to a particular trigger. And, mast cells and histamine are not always a bad thing. So we have to remember, kind of stepping back to how our immune system works, when we are faced with an insult, an injury, a toxic exposure, our immune system's job is to create inflammation, right? A lot of us think, oh my gosh, get the inflammation down. In conventional medicine, we squash inflammation with, steroids and ibuprofen. And there is a time and a place for that. But if our immune system is working normally, we should be able to create this inflammation. Think about a cut on your arm where, it gets a little red at first. That's a recruitment of those immune cells. Mast cells are involved in that inflammatory process, and they release histamine. What's one of the roles of histamine? Histamine dilates our blood vessels, and so that allows better blood flow to that area to get all of those great, nutrients and immune chemicals and other immune cells to go to that area of injury and help out and heal. Now, the other role of our immune system is then to understand and recognize when the job of inflammation is done. And then we have this other branch of our immune system that comes, this counter-regulatory part of our immune system that comes and says, hey guys, immune activation, inflammation, you've done your job. Let's go back down to normal baseline and get back to health. Chronic disease happens when this immune response, this inflammation response, doesn't go back to baseline. It's persistent and chronic. So, when we talk about mast cell activation and histamine, there's a lot of information now online. It's become kind of the new buzzword. It seems like everyone has mast cell activation. Histamine and mast cells are not a bad thing. We don't want to get rid of all histamine. We don't want to get rid of all mast cells, right? That there's a reason why our immune systems have developed to have mast cells. And histamine is an amazing chemical. We have histamine receptors on every single cell in our body and brain, on our immune cells, on our brain cells, of course, in our lungs and in our stomach and in our sinuses and our skin. So we know histamine. Most of us know histamine because of the quote allergy symptoms that we see, like runny nose, itchy eyes, hives on the skin, wheezing in the lungs, and reflux. Histamine is responsible for releasing more hydrochloric acid from our gastric cells. So those are the symptoms that we might see more commonly. But some of the signs that we see that histamine is becoming a problem is when we see these chronic illnesses that are associated or have in common histamine overload and mast cell activation. And that we see in kids with autism, ADHD, kids with PANS and PANDAS, which I talk a lot about. Asthma, allergies, any classic histamine-related concern, and also autoimmune illnesses. Many, many autoimmune illnesses have underlying, in part, a mast cell activation and histamine problem. So mast cells are really important to understand. They can be a good thing, but then when we're chronically overloaded, they're not so good for us.
Gotcha. So that inflammatory response you were talking about, is that what you call the cell danger response?
So in part, some people, some practitioners will say that, the cell danger response is Dr. Navio's, term for mast cell activation. And it's, it's not that simple. So Dr. Robert Navio, he is at UC San Diego. He is the expert in mitochondrial disorders and he has identified this cell danger response. His work is fascinating. I think that his work is really groundbreaking and really important to get for functional medicine practitioners to really wrap their head around, because I think the work that he's doing is going to provide the basis for a lot of our healing opportunities for kids, because I'll see kids with, autism or PANS or PANDAS or autoimmune illness, and you'll get them better and you're like, yes, we're on the right track, and then all of a sudden things slide back. Or you have kids where you're doing all the right things that have helped other kids, but this child is kind of stuck. And I think the cell danger response is underlying a lot of that. So what is a cell danger response? The cell danger response is literally, it's our primitive, we developed this back in the primordial days, right? Primitive cellular response to protect ourselves against a threat. And that threat can be chemical. like glyphosate, Roundup. It can be physical, it can be biological, like an infection, and it can even be psychological. So there are psychological threats too. So this is also where we know that psychological uh, threats can cause as much inflammation and immune dysregulation as anything physical. So we really do need to pay attention to that, body-mind connection. So what he described was a healing cycle, where in a healthy person, we're in the health state, the health cycle, where we have our waking metabolic activities, and then we have our sleeping metabolic activities that help us detoxify and regulate and restore. When we're faced with a threat, the cell danger response is triggered. Right. And in that cell danger response, there are 3 subsets. And I mean, his work is so dense that even I have to read his articles 50 times to just kind of every time I'm like, oh, I got another fact. Right. So I'm not going to go into the crazy intense metabolic, cascade that happens. But essentially, in these 3 phases of the cell danger response, there's a wave of metabolic changes. In the first stage, you have this release of ATP. ATP is really important for that's what our mitochondria produce, our cellular energy currency, and we have this release of histamine, right? And so we have then this sort of mitochondrial activation, mast cell activation that occurs in that first stage, and then as we go through the cell danger response, we then get recruitment of immune cells, we neutralize the threat, and then we allow that cell to repair and regenerate, and then go back into the health state, right? So what Dr. Navio has described and is known in many, many chronic illnesses, including autoimmune illnesses, neurodevelopmental and psychiatric illnesses, is that the cell danger response for many people will get stuck, right? It's in this stuck state where we see mitochondrial dysfunction, where we see mast cell activation persistence, right? That then doesn't allow the immune system and the body to get back into that metabolic state of health and wellness. And so if we can understand that, then we can know, all right, even if our kids or our adult patients have not been diagnosed with mast cell activation disorder, which is a really hard diagnosis, we know that most of our kids are going to have mast cell activation, right? Most of our kids are going to have mitochondrial dysfunction, and we need to support that if we want to get them back into the healing cycle. So I tell parents, don't get hung up on getting a diagnosis. It does not matter what label, you put on what's going on with your kid. What matters is understanding the biochemical imbalances so that we know what supplements and what lifestyle changes can help support those biochemical imbalances to get them back into that health cycle and really complete the healing cycle once your child's cells have entered that cell danger response.
So if it gets stuck, is it getting stuck, or is it more the case that whatever is triggering that cell danger response is still there? So like if it's a toxin or a low-grade chronic infection or mold exposure or something like that?
That is such a great question, because it actually can be both, right? Sometimes the initial, let's say in PANDAS, if it was triggered by strep, or PANS, if it was triggered by Lyme disease, right, or influenza. Sometimes the initial, or Epstein-Barr, sometimes the initial infection, it will actually resolve, and killing more and more and more is not necessarily going to be the answer. The answer is going to be to really address the cell danger response and this mitochondrial dysfunction and mast cell activation. On the flip side, you are not going to get into the health state, the health cycle, if you don't, quote, neutralize or get rid of that initial insult. So if the strep is still active, if you're still living in a house filled with mycotoxins, if you're still, eating a lot of food with glyphosate, right? The cell danger response is going to stay stuck because you're not allowing that initial trigger to release, and the cells to say, oh, the threat's neutralized, because the threat hasn't been neutralized. So it's actually both. That's a great question.